The first indication that something was wrong came on a Tuesday evening. I had just returned home from a grueling 14-hour shift on an oil rig. I was exhausted, and all I wanted was a hot shower and my wife's warm embrace. However, when I walked through the door, the house was dark and empty. "Susan," I called out, turning on lights as I walked through our modest ranch-style home. No response. When I pulled out my phone to call her, I noticed a text from earlier. "Girls' night out. Do not wait. XO." I frowned and threw my phone onto the kitchen counter with more force than necessary. This was the third girls' night this month. When did Susan become so popular? And on a Tuesday, no less. I shook off the nagging feeling in my stomach, grabbed a beer from the refrigerator, and collapsed on the couch. "That's fine," I told myself. "She can have a social life. Just because I work long hours doesn't mean she has to stay at home waiting for me." But the days turned into weeks. That nagging feeling intensified into a gnawing anxiety I couldn't shake. Susan became more distant, spending less time at home and offering vague explanations for her frequent absences. When we were together, she appeared distracted, often staring at her phone with a small smile on her lips. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia. After all, I'd never been a jealous person. Susan and I had been happily married for 8 years. Why would things change now? But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it away, the unease remained. It all came to a head one sunny Saturday afternoon. I was cleaning out my truck in preparation for a fishing trip with my buddy Randolph the following day. While vacuuming under the passenger seat, something caught my eye. A crumpled receipt wedged between the seat and the center console. Curious, I took it out and smoothed it flat. My blood ran cold as I read the details. A receipt from the Riverside Inn and Suites from a weekend 3 weeks ago, when Susan had claimed to be visiting her sister in the next state. I stared at the damning piece of paper, refusing to believe what it was telling me. But as the initial shock subsided, a cold fury rose in my chest. I'd been taken for a fool. I stormed into the house, ready to confront Susan, but she wasn't home. Of course, she wasn't. Taking deep breaths, I forced myself to think logically. I needed more evidence before confronting her. If she was deceiving me, I hoped I was mistaken. But I needed to be wise about this. I called Randolph, my voice tight as I explained the situation. "I need your help, man," I said. "I think Susan has been lying to me, and I need to know for sure." Randolph let out a low whistle. "Jason, that's heavy. What do you need?" "You're the tech whiz," I said. "Is there any way I can track her phone or see who she's been talking to?" There was a pause at the other end of the line. "Are you sure about this, Jay? Once you go down this road," I cut him off. "I need to know the truth, Randolph, whatever it is." He exhaled. "All right, man. I'll come over in an hour. We'll figure this out." Randolph delivered on his promise, arriving with a laptop and a serious expression. He helped me install spyware on Susan's phone while she was out running errands. It didn't feel right. Invasive even. But I suppressed the guilt. If she had nothing to hide, she had nothing to worry about. The following few days were torturous. At work, I went through the motions, constantly thinking about what might be on Susan's phone. Each night, I'd lock myself in my home office and go over the information Randolph's program had gathered. At first, there was nothing too incriminating. Just texts and phone calls from a number I didn't recognize. Then came the photographs, intimate shots, clearly not intended for my eyes. Finally, the smoking gun. A voice message from Susan to someone named Clive Adams. "I miss you already." Susan's voice came through the computer speakers. "Last night was amazing. I can't wait to see you again." I sat stunned, the gravity of her betrayal washing over me. It wasn't a one-time fling or mistake. She was in love with this man. How long had this been going on? How many times had she lied to me, kissed me goodbye, and then run into his arms? The rage that had been simmering for days finally erupted. I slammed my fist against the desk, The sharp pain in my hand nothing compared to the pain in my chest. I don't remember much of what followed. I know I drank a lot. I'm sure I broke things in my office, smashing picture frames and hurling books. And I'm sure Susan knew something was wrong when she came home that night and found me sitting in the dark living room with a tumbler of whiskey in my hand. "Jason," she asked hesitantly, flicking on the light. "What's wrong? Why are you sitting in the dark?" I looked up at her, taking in the woman I thought I knew. She was beautiful. My Susan had long chestnut hair, bright green eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. How often had that smile been a lie? "Sit down," I said, my voice gravelly from the whiskey and unched tears. "We need to talk." She paled, clearly sensing the impending storm. "Jason, whatever you think." "Sit down," I growled, leaving no room for debate. She slumped into the armchair across from me, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "What is this about?" Rather than answer, I took out my phone and pressed play on the damning voice note. Susan's voice filled the room. As she listened, the color drained from her face. When it was over, she opened her mouth, likely to offer some excuse, but I interrupted her. "Don't," I said, raising a hand. "Don't even try to lie your way out of this. I know everything, Susan. I've seen the texts and photos. I know about your weekend trips with Clive while you were supposed to be visiting your sister." Tears filled her eyes. "Jason, please. Listen," I roared, jumping to my feet. The whiskey glass shattered against the fireplace as I threw it across the room. "Listen to how you've been with another man for who knows how long. Explain how you've been lying to me every day. Go ahead, Susan. I'm all ears." She flinched at my outburst, shrinking back into her chair. "I'm sorry," she whimpered. "I never meant for this to happen. It started as harmless flirting. And then what?" I demanded. "You just fell into his arms. Fell in love with him. How long has this been going on, Susan?" She couldn't meet my eyes. "A year," she whispered. The words hit me like a physical blow. A year. 12 months of lies and betrayal. I felt sick. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What did I do wrong? What does he have that I don't?" "Nothing," she insisted, finally looking up at me. "You didn't do anything wrong, Jason. It's not about you. It's—" "Don't give me that," I snapped. "This has everything to do with me. You made a vow. Susan, for better or worse, remember. Was that all a lie too?" She shook her head frantically. "No, of course not. I love you, Jason, I do. It's just, Clive. He made me feel alive again. Desired. I know it's no excuse, but—" "You're right," I said coldly, cutting her off. "It's not an excuse. Nothing you say can excuse this." We lapsed into silence, the weight of her betrayal hanging heavy between us. I paced the living room, trying to process everything. Susan remained in her chair, silent tears streaming down her face. Finally, I turned to face her. "Is there anything else I should know?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. "Any other bombs you'd like to drop?" She hesitated, and I knew there was more. "What is it?" I demanded. Susan took a shaky breath. I'm pregnant," she whispered. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her, but the look on her face confirmed it. My wife was pregnant, and she didn't know if the baby was mine. The room spun around me as the full impact of her words hit home. I stumbled back and collapsed onto the couch as my legs gave out. "Jason?" Susan's voice sounded distant. "Jason, please say something." I looked up at her, the stranger with my wife's face. In that moment, all I felt was cold, hard hatred. "Get out," I replied quietly. She blinked, confused. "What?" I said, "Get out." I roared, jumping to my feet. "Get out of my house. I can't even look at you right now." Susan scrambled to her feet and backed away from me. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, her voice small and terrified. "I don't care," I spat. "Go to your sister's. Go to a hotel. Or better yet, run to Clive. Just get out of my sight before I do something I'll regret." She hesitated for a moment before fleeing upstairs. I heard her moving around, packing a bag. 10 minutes later, she came back down, her eyes red and puffy. "Jason, please." She tried one last time. "Can't we talk about this?" I didn't even look at her. "There's nothing to talk about. You've made your choice. Now deal with it." The front door opened and closed, and just like that, she was gone. I stood there in the silence of our once happy home, feeling as if my entire world had just collapsed. As the adrenaline from the confrontation wore off, exhaustion hit me like a freight train. I walked upstairs to our bedroom, my bedroom now, I supposed, and collapsed onto the bed. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was accompanied by nightmares of Susan in the arms of another man. The next few days were a blur of anger, pain, and far too much whiskey. I called in sick at work, unable to face the idea of pretending everything was normal. Instead, I hid in my house, ignoring calls and texts from concerned friends and family. My mother was the one who finally broke through my self-imposed isolation on the third day of my bender. She arrived at the house, armed with Tupperware containers full of food and a determined gleam in her eye. "Jason Michael Cooper," she called out as she entered using her spare key. "I know you are in here. You cannot hide from your mother." I groaned from my seat on the couch. An empty bottle of Jack was resting against my chest. "Go away, Mom," I muttered. She appeared in the living room doorway, examining the mess with a critical eye. Empty bottles littered the coffee table, and the stench of stale cigar smoke hung in the air. "Oh, Jason," she sighed, her expression softening with sympathy. "What did that woman do to you?" Before I could protest, she was dragging me off the couch and directing me to the bathroom. "You're going to take a shower," she announced firmly. "Then you'll eat something that isn't liquid and contains 80 proof. After that, we will talk." I knew I shouldn't argue with my mother when she used that tone. 20 minutes later, freshly showered and feeling slightly more human, I sat at the kitchen table while Mom was busy reheating some of her famous chicken noodle soup. "Now," she said, placing a steaming bowl in front of me, "tell me everything." So I did. I spilled the whole sordid story. My suspicions, the evidence I'd gathered, Susan's confession, and the shocking pregnancy announcement. Mom listened without interrupting, her expression becoming stormier with each new revelation. After I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm very sorry, sweetheart," she spoke softly. "You did not deserve any of this." "What am I going to do, Mom?" I inquired, hating how small and weak my voice sounded. "How can I just move on from this?" She was silent for a moment. "Take it one day at a time," she said finally. "And remember, you are not alone in this. You've got me. You've got friends. We'll get you through this." As if on cue, there was a knock on the door. Mom proceeded to answer it, returning a moment later accompanied by Shelley, Susan's mother. I tensed, expecting a fight, but Shelley marched right up to me and wrapped me in a fierce hug. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I'm not sure where I went wrong with that girl, but please believe me when I say I never raised her to act like this." I awkwardly patted her back, unsure of how to react. When she backed away, her eyes blazed with righteous fury. "I have half a mind to drive over to my sister's and drag Susan back here by her hair," she declared. "Make her face the consequences of her actions." "Shelley," my mother said in warning, "that won't help anyone right now." Shelley deflated slightly. "You're right, of course. I can't believe she'd do this to a good man like Jason for some homewrecker." I cleared my throat, uneasy about the direction the conversation was taking. "Have you spoken to Susan?" I asked hesitantly. Shelley's face darkened. "Oh, I've spoken to her. All right. That girl is lucky I didn't tell her to hide like I did when she was younger, pregnant or not. In my opinion, she is still young enough to benefit from a good talking to." Despite everything, I felt a small smile forming on my lips. Shelley had always been a force of nature, and it was strangely reassuring to know that some things hadn't changed. Another knock on the door interrupted the conversation. This time, Randolph appeared, concerned and slightly out of breath. "Sorry for barging in," he said as he entered the kitchen. "I've been trying to reach you for days, man. You okay?" I nodded. "I'm surviving," I said. "Thanks for stopping by." Randolph sat down and nodded respectfully to my mother and Shelley. "So, what's the plan?" he asked, getting straight to the point. "What do you intend to do about all of this?" I exhaled. "Honestly, I have no idea. I can't even get my head around all of this." "Well, the first thing you should do is get a paternity test," Shelley stated firmly. "If that baby isn't yours, you shouldn't be responsible for it." I nodded slowly. It was the logical next step, but the thought made my stomach turn. "Yeah, you're right," I said. "I'll call the doctor tomorrow. Set something up." "And you should consult with a lawyer," Mom added. "Even if you decide to try to work things out, you need to protect yourself." I hadn't even considered reconciliation. The mere suggestion of it sparked a new wave of rage within me. "There's nothing to work out," I stated coldly. "She made her decision. Now she can deal with the consequences." An uncomfortable silence fell over the kitchen. Randolph finally spoke up. "Whatever you decide to do, man, I've got your back. We all do." I glanced around at the people gathered in my kitchen, my mother, mother-in-law, and best friend, all here to support me. For the first time in days, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe I could make it through this after all. "Thank you," I spoke, my voice rough with emotion. "All of you. I'm not sure what I'd do without you." Over the next few days, with the help of my impromptu team, I began to pull myself together. Mom practically moved in, ensuring I ate and took care of myself. Randolph helped me gather and organize all of our evidence for the lawyer. Shelley, bless her, took it upon herself to interfere with Susan, answering her calls and trying to keep her at bay. A week after the confrontation, I found myself sitting in a sterile doctor's office, waiting for the results of the paternity test. Susan sat across the room, pale and drawn. We hadn't spoken since she arrived. The doctor had a somber expression on his face, and my heart dropped before he even opened his mouth. "Mr. Cooper," he began gently, "I'm afraid the test results indicate that you are not the biological father of Mrs. Cooper's child." Despite my suspicions, the words struck me like a physical blow. Hearing it confirmed made it more real than it had been before. I closed my eyes, fighting back the nausea that threatened to overtake me. Across the room, Susan let out a choked cry. "Jason," she pleaded. "Jason, please look at me." I opened my eyes and fixed her with a cold stare. "What do you want me to say, Susan?" "Congratulations. I hope you and Clive are very happy together." She flinched as if I had slapped her. "It isn't like that," she insisted. "Jason, I made a horrible mistake. But I do love you. We can work through this. Please give me another chance." I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that surprised even me. "Another chance? Are you kidding me? You threw away 8 years of marriage for a fling with some rich guy, and now you're expecting his child. There are no more chances, Susan. We're done." Without saying anything else, I stood up and walked out of the office, ignoring Susan's tearful pleas behind me. I made it to my truck before the shock subsided and anger erupted in a roar of frustration. I slammed my fist into the steering wheel repeatedly until the pain in my hand matched the agony in my chest. I don't remember the drive home. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my living room, a bottle of whiskey in hand, staring at the wall of photos that documented our life together. 8 years of memories, each tainted by her betrayal. In a fit of rage, I stood up and started tearing the photos off the wall, smashing frames and ripping up images of our happy, oblivious faces. By the time I was finished, the floor was littered with broken glass and torn paper, a fitting metaphor for the breakdown of my marriage. Randolph found me slumped on the floor, surrounded by debris, the now empty whiskey bottle dangling from my fingers. "Jesus, Jay," he muttered, carefully stepping through the chaos. "Come on, man. Let's get you cleaned up." As he helped me to my feet, I looked at him blearily. "She's pregnant with his baby, Randy. What the hell do I do now?" Randolph's face hardened. "You're going to pull yourself together," he stated firmly. "And then we're going to make sure that woman and her lover pay for what they did to you." His words cut through the alcohol-induced haze, sparking something dangerous within me. "You're right," I said, my voice low and determined. "No more feeling sorry for myself. It's time to fight back." The next morning, nursing a killer hangover but fueled by a renewed determination, I met Randolph at a small diner on the outskirts of town. We needed privacy for what we were about to discuss. "All right," I said once we'd ordered coffee and made sure no one was listening in. "What do we know about Clive Adams?" Randolph took out his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "I did some digging," he said. "Clive Adams, 42 years old, CEO of Adams Enterprises, a real estate development company. He's got a reputation as a bit of a playboy, but nothing concrete has ever stuck to him." I scowled. "So he makes a habit of seducing married women?" Randolph nodded. "Looks like it. Over the last 5 years, I found at least 3 other women in similar situations. He wines and dines them, convinces them to leave their husbands, and then, well, let's just say things don't end well for the women." My hands clenched into fists. "That guy is going to pay for this. Both of them will." "I'm with you, man," Randolph said. "But we need to be smart about this. Clive's got money and connections. We can't just go after him directly." I nodded, forcing myself to think rationally. "You're right. We need more information, more evidence." For the next few hours, we pored over everything Randolph had managed to dig up on Clive Adams. Bank records, business dealings, social media posts, anything that might give us an edge. As we were wrapping up, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it, my eyebrows raising as I read the message. "What is it?" Randolph asked, noticing my expression. I showed him the phone. "It's from someone named Clifton Loomis. Says he's a journalist and wants to talk to me about Clive Adams." Randolph frowned. "You think it's legit?" I shrugged. "Only one way to find out." I called the number, and a gruff voice answered. "Clifton Loomis here." "This is Jason Cooper," I said. "You wanted to talk about Clive Adams." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Not over the phone." Loomis said finally. "Meet me at the Blue Moon Cafe in an hour. Come alone." The line went dead before I could respond. I looked at Randolph, who nodded. "Go," he said. "I'll keep digging. But be careful, man. We don't know who this guy is, or what he wants." An hour later, I was sitting in a booth at the Blue Moon Cafe, nursing a cup of coffee and trying not to appear as nervous as I felt. A man in his mid-50s slid into the seat across from me, salt and pepper hair, and the look of someone who had seen his fair share of hard times. "Jason Cooper?" he asked, his tone matching the one I'd heard on the phone. I nodded. "Clifton Loomis, I presume." He grunted in agreement, then leaned forward, his voice low. "I hear you've got a beef with Clive Adams." I tensed. "How do you know about that?" Loomis smirked. "I'm a journalist, kid. It's my job to know things. I've been tracking Adams for years, trying to nail him. But he's elusive, always a step ahead." "So why come to me?" I asked, still wary. "Because you've got something I need," Loomis said. "A personal experience, a first-hand account of how Adams operates, and I'm guessing you want something too. Revenge." I studied him for a long moment, weighing my options. Eventually, I nodded. "Okay, I'm listening. What's your proposal?" Loomis laid out his plan to expose Clive's operations, not just his affairs but also some of his shadier business deals. All he needed was my story to tie everything together. "I can't promise it'll fix everything," Loomis said, "but it'll certainly make Clive's life difficult. Might even bring him down for good." I thought about Susan, the baby she was carrying, and the life I'd thought we had together. Then I thought of Clive Adams, smug and self-assured, believing he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. "I'm in," I said, my voice hard and determined. "Let's take him down." Loomis, Randolph, and I worked tirelessly for the next several weeks to gather evidence and build our case against Clive Adams. What we uncovered was disturbing, to say the least. Not only were there affairs, but there was also financial fraud, intimidation tactics, and hints of violence against women who threatened to expose him. Susan tried to contact me several times, calling, texting, even showing up at my house once or twice. Each time, I shut her down completely. I wasn't interested in her apologies or her tears. As far as I was concerned, she was just as guilty as Clive. Randolph was the one who finally pointed out the obvious. "You know," he said one night while we were going over some financial documents, "Susan might be our secret weapon. She knows stuff about Clive that could be crucial in bringing him down." I was hesitant to involve her, but I had to admit Randolph was right. Swallowing my pride, I agreed to meet with Susan. We met in a neutral location, a park near our old house. Susan was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench, her hands resting on her slightly swollen belly. The sight of her pregnancy made my chest tighten, but I pushed the feeling aside. "Jason," she said, standing as I approached, "thank you for meeting with me." I cut her off. "Save it," I said coldly. "I'm not here to reconcile. I need information on Clive Adams." Her face fell, but she nodded. "What do you want to know?" For the next hour, I grilled her on her relationship with Clive. Dates, locations, anything she might have overheard about his business dealings. To her credit, Susan answered everything without hesitation, even offering up information I hadn't thought to ask for. As the meeting came to a close, Susan reached out, her hand hovering over mine. "Jason," she said softly, "I know you hate me right now, and you have every right to. But I need you to know how sorry I am. I wish I could take it all back." I jerked my hand away. "But you can't," I said. "What's done is done. Thank you for the information, Susan. I hope it helps nail that jerk to the wall." I turned to leave, but her voice stopped me. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her tone laced with fear. I met her gaze with an impassive expression. "I'm going to destroy him," I replied simply. "And if you get caught in the crossfire, just remember, you made your own bed. Now lie in it." With that, I walked away, leaving Susan alone on the bench, her hand still outstretched towards me. Randolph was able to hack into Clive's personal email a few days later, which completed our plan. What we discovered there was the smoking gun. We needed emails detailing his schemes and affairs, as well as discussions about how to deal with women who threatened to expose him. Armed with this wealth of evidence, Loomis was prepared to publish his expose. But before he could, we received an unexpected visitor. I was at home, reviewing the final draft of the Loomis article, when there was a knock on my door. I opened it to discover Clive Adams himself standing on my porch. His face was red with rage. "Do you think you can mess with me, Cooper?" He snarled and pushed past me into the house. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I stood my ground and stared him down. "I know who I'm messing with," I replied calmly. "A coward who preys on innocent women. A fraud who is about to receive exactly what he deserves." Clive's eyes narrowed. "Is that so? Okay, let me tell you something, you pathetic little man. I've ruined men who were better than you. By the time I finish with you, you'll be lucky to get a job flipping burgers." I laughed coldly and mirthlessly. "Go ahead and try it, but first, you might want to check your email. I have a feeling you'll be too busy to worry about me." Confusion flashed across Clive's face, followed by dawning horror as he realized what I was saying. Without another word, he turned and fled, almost tripping over himself in his haste to reach his car. As I watched him leave, a sense of satisfaction settled over me. The trap was set. Now all we had to do was spring it. The next morning, Loomis' article made the front page of every major newspaper in the state. The story quickly spread and was picked up by national news outlets. Clive Adams' carefully constructed world collapsed around him within hours. By the time the dust settled, I sat in my living room, watching the fallout on the news. Clive was facing several criminal charges. His company was in disarray, and the women he had used and abandoned were coming forward in droves, each with their own tale of manipulation and betrayal. Randolph appeared at my side and handed me a beer. "We made it, man," he said, clinking his bottle against mine. "We got rid of that jerk." I nodded and took a long pull from the bottle. "Yes," I said. "Yes, we did." But as I watched Clive being led away in handcuffs, his face twisted with rage and disbelief, I realized something. The victory seemed hollow. It did not take away the pain of Susan's betrayal. It did not mend my broken marriage or restore my lost trust. Randolph seemed to understand my mood. "You okay?" he asked, his expression one of concern. I exhaled. "I don't know, man. I thought this would make me feel better, you know, as if it would fix everything." He nodded sympathetically. "It's not so simple, bro. But hey, it's a start, right? You stood up for yourself. You didn't let them get away with it. That's something." I managed a small smile. "Yeah, I suppose you're right." As the news cycle progressed to the next big story, I found myself at a crossroads. The previous few months had altered me in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. I was tougher now, less trusting, but I was also stronger. I had overcome the worst betrayal imaginable. Now it was time to figure out what would happen next. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since the nightmare began, I felt prepared to confront it. Whatever life threw at me next, I knew I could handle it. After all, I had already endured the worst. Everything else was merely details. Clifton's article appeared on newsstands that morning. I awoke to the sound of my phone buzzing constantly. Bleary-eyed, I fumbled for it, squinting at the screen. There were dozens of missed calls and messages. "What the hell?" I muttered, opening the first message, which was a link to an online news article. The headline caused my heart to race. ***, Clive Adams, tech mogul, exposed in web of deception, fraud, and intimidation ***. Holy, I muttered, frantically scrolling through the article. Everything was laid out in black and white. Clifton had done an excellent job combining the evidence we gathered into a damning expose. Photos, email excerpts, financial records, everything was there. My phone vibrated again. "Randolph," I answered, hearing his excited voice on the other end. "Jay, that jerk is going down. We did it." A smile appeared on my face. "Yeah, we did." As the day progressed, the story exploded. Every news channel, website, and radio station seemed to be focused solely on Clive Adams and his spectacular fall from grace. Around noon, the doorbell rang. I opened it and saw Clifton standing there, haggard but triumphant. "We've created quite a storm," he remarked in greeting. I nodded and ushered him inside. "This is one way to put it. Come inside. Have a beer. You seem like you could use one." We sat in my living room, the TV muted in the background as commentators debated every aspect of the scandal. "So," I said, grabbing a beer, "what does the fallout look like?" Clifton's eyes gleamed. "It's beautiful, kid. Adams Enterprises stock is in freefall. Half of his board has already resigned. And get this, his wife filed for divorce this morning." "Wow," I said, still trying to process everything. Clifton nodded. "Yep, she must have known about some of his indiscretions for years, but this was the final nail in the coffin." I leaned back, taking it all in. Any word from the man himself? "So far, radio silence," Clifton replied. "But my sources say he's holed up with his lawyers, figuring out how to save himself." "Good luck with that," I muttered. Just then, my phone rang. An unknown number. I answered with trepidation. "Hello. You think you're clever." Clive's voice, tight with barely controlled rage, came through the speaker. You and your hacker journalist friend. I put my phone on speaker, exchanging a glance with Clifton. I'm not sure what you're talking about, Clive, I said calmly. Don't play dumb with me, you little, he snarled. I know you're behind this. You've made a huge mistake, Cooper. I'm going to destroy you. I laughed harshly. Destroy me? Clive, your reputation is in ruins. Your company is failing. Face it, you're done. You don't know who you're dealing with, Clive hissed. I still have friends in high places. When I'm done with you, you'll be lucky to land a job flipping burgers. Bring it, I growled. I'm not afraid of you, Clive. You're nothing but a bully and a coward. And now the whole world knows. I hung up, my hand shaking slightly as I placed the phone down. Clifton whistled softly. Well, that was intense. You okay? I nodded and took a deep breath. Yeah, I'm good. It's all becoming real, you know. He clapped my shoulder. I get it. But listen, kid, you did well. We exposed a predator. Whatever happens next, remember that. As if on cue, my phone vibrated with a text message from my boss at the drilling company. Asterisk, I need to see you at my office tomorrow morning. Urgent. Asterisk. I showed Clifton the message. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. Clive's claim about having friends in high places might be real, I said. Clifton's face hardened. You knew this might happen. Are you ready for it? I squared my shoulders. Bring it on. I'd rather flip burgers with a clear conscience than work for people on Clive's payroll. The next morning, I walked into my boss's office, my head held high. Sit down, Jason, he said, not meeting my gaze. I'll stand, thanks, I replied, remaining on my feet. What is this about, Frank? He exhaled, finally looking up at me. You know what it's about. This mess with Clive Adams. The company's getting a lot of heat, Jason. Investors are nervous. We have to distance ourselves. Are you suspending me? I asked flatly. Frank nodded, visibly uncomfortable. Just until it all blows over. It's not personal, you understand. It's just business. I laughed bitterly. Nothing personal. I exposed a predator and a fraud, and I'm the one being punished. That's quite the message you're sending, Frank. Jason, please, he pleaded. My hands are tied here. Adams still has a lot of influence in this industry, if we don't play ball. I raised a hand, cutting him off. Save it. I don't want to hear your excuses. I took a USB drive from my pocket and tossed it onto his desk. This contains documented evidence of every transaction this company has ever had with Clive Adams. Every contract, email, and under-the-table agreement. So think carefully about your next move. His face turned pale as he stared at the innocuous-looking thumb drive. Are you threatening me, Jason? I smiled, all teeth and no warmth. Not at all. I'm just giving you all the facts so you can make an informed decision. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some packing to do. I walked out of his office without looking back, ignoring the stares and whispers as I cleared my desk. Let them talk. I knew I had done the right thing. And that's all that mattered. As I drove home, my phone rang. Susan's number appeared on the screen. After a moment of hesitation, I answered. What do you want, Susan? Her voice was shaky and on the verge of tears. Jason, please, I need to talk to you. Can we meet? I sighed and pinched the bridge of my nose. I don't think that's a good idea. Please, she begged. Everything is falling apart. I don't know what to do. You're the only one who might understand. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a downtown coffee shop. When I arrived, I barely recognized her. Gone was the polished woman I had married. In her place sat a pale, disheveled figure with haunted eyes. You look like a mess, I said bluntly, sliding into the seat across from her. She gave a weak smile. Hello to you too. What do you want, Susan? I asked. Let's cut to the chase. I'm not here to hold your hand or hear your excuses. Her face crumpled. I know I wasn't sure where else to turn. Everyone's abandoned me. Friends, coworkers, even my mother won't return my calls. I leaned back and looked at her calmly. What were you expecting? You made your bed. Now you must lie in it. I understand, she whispered. I know I messed up, but Jason, you have to believe me. I never intended for any of this to happen. I snorted. No kidding. You fell for a manipulative man, and you expect sympathy. Her eyes filled with anger. That's not fair. You don't understand how he made me feel. I cut her off. I'm not interested in justifications. You had a choice, Susan. You chose him over me and our marriage. You're responsible for everything that's happened. Tears streamed down her cheeks. You're right. I know you're right. I just don't know what to do now. I'm pregnant, alone, and everyone hates me. I almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered the pain and betrayal. My heart hardened. I stood up. That's no longer my problem. You made your choices, Susan. You'll have to live with them. As I walked away, I heard her call out, Jason, wait. I paused. What? I'm sorry, she whispered, for everything. I nodded once, acknowledging her words but not accepting them. Goodbye, Susan. Walking out of the coffee shop, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was closure, a final chapter in that part of my life. As I drove home, my phone buzzed with a text from Randolph. Asterisk, the feds have brought Clive in for questioning. It's happening, man asterisk. A smile crept onto my face. The wheels of justice were turning, slowly but surely. Clive's day of reckoning was near, and I'd be there to witness it. Weeks after Clive's exposure were a blur. I was juggling depositions, meetings with lawyers, and fending off desperate attempts by Clive's team to discredit me. Randolph was always there, supporting me and offering strategic advice. One day, while reviewing documents in Randolph's office, he brought up something I had been avoiding. You know, he said carefully, we might need to bring Susan into this. I stiffened, jaw clenched. Absolutely not. Randolph held up his hands. Hear me out, Jay. She was closer to Clive than anyone. She might know things, details that could help take him down. I shook my head. No way. She's made her bed. Let her lie in it. I get it, Randolph said, but if her testimony can put Clive away for good. I slammed my hand down, making him jump. I said no, Randolph. End of discussion. He backed off. All right, just a thought. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. The only sound was the rustling of papers. After a few minutes, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Hello, I answered warily. Jason, it's Madeleine. Madeleine Reeves. I remembered her. What's happening? Her voice was tense. I need to talk to you in person. It's important. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from Madeleine in a quiet park. She looked nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder. What's this about, Madeleine? I asked. She took a deep breath. Clive contacted me. He wants me to recant my statement. Says if I do, he'll make it worth my while. My blood ran cold. He's trying to buy you off. She nodded, her voice shaky. I don't know what to do, Jason. I'm scared. You don't know what he's capable of. I leaned forward. Listen to me, Madeleine. I know exactly what he's capable of, which is why we can't let him win. If you back down, he'll keep doing this to other women. Is that what you want? Tears welled in her eyes. No, of course not. But what if he comes after me or my family? I reached out, squeezing her hand. We won't let that happen. I promise you, Madeleine, we're going to bring him down. But we need your help. Can you hold on a little longer? She wiped her eyes and nodded. Yes, I can do this. Good, I said. Now tell me everything about your conversation with Clive. As Madeleine described Clive's desperate attempts at witness tampering, a plan formed in my mind. We could use this against him. I was so focused on our conversation that I didn't notice the figure approaching until a shadow fell over us. I looked up and froze. Susan stood there, her hand resting on her swollen belly, eyes full of hurt and anger. "Well," she said, voice brittle, "isn't this cozy?" I stood slowly, positioning myself between Susan and Madeline. "It's not what you think." Susan laughed bitterly. "Oh, Jason, what exactly am I supposed to think? You're destroying my life while cozying up to other women." Madeline opened her mouth to speak, but I stopped her with a look. This was my mess to clean up. "Susan, you don't get to play the victim here," I said in a low voice. "You gave that up when you got involved with Clive. Madeline is helping us build a case against him, and that's all." Tears filled Susan's eyes as she pleaded, "I made a mistake, Jason. How many times do I have to apologize?" I felt a flash of sympathy, but quickly replaced it with memories of her betrayal. "Sorry doesn't cut it, Susan. Not this time." Her face hardened. "Okay, if that's how you want to play it. But remember, I know things about Clive that could blow the case wide open. If you want my help, you'll have to give me something in return." I stared at her, barely recognizing the woman I once loved. "Are you blackmailing me?" She shrugged, a cold smile on her lips. "Call it whatever you want. Think about it, Jason. I'm offering you a chance to take Clive down. All I ask for is a fair shake during the divorce. Split everything 50-50. Drop the alimony demands. That's my offer." Rage surged through me. "You've got some nerve, Susan, after everything you've done." She cut me off. "I'm no longer the naive little wife, Jason. I've learned a few things from Clive. So, do we have a deal?" I glared at her, thoughts racing. She might have the information we needed, but could I trust her? "I'll think about it," I said. "But don't push me. You're already on thin ice." She nodded, appearing satisfied. "Fair enough. You know how to reach me when you've made your decision." As she walked away, I turned back to Madeline, who watched the exchange wide-eyed. "I'm sorry you had to witness that." Madeline shook her head. "No, I understand why you're doing this. It's not just about Clive, is it? It's personal." I nodded. "You're right. It is personal. But that doesn't change what has to be done. Clive needs to be stopped, no matter what." Madeline stood, gathering her belongings. "I'm with you, Jason. Whatever you need." As I watched her leave, my mind raced. Susan's offer was dangerous, but it could be the key to taking Clive down. Back at Randolph's, I filled him in on everything. He let out a low whistle. "Man, that's a lot to process. What are you thinking?" I paced the room. "I don't know. Susan's offer could change everything, but can we trust her?" Randolph shook his head emphatically. "Hell no. She's proven she can't be trusted. But maybe we can use her. Play her game, but on our terms." A plan formed in my mind. "You're right. We'll make her think we're playing along, but we'll be ready for any double cross." For the next few days, we carefully orchestrated our approach. I agreed to meet Susan to discuss her terms. We met at a neutral location, a lawyer's office. When I arrived, Susan was already there, looking composed but nervous. Our lawyer, Hugo Jacobs, sat at the head of the table, expression impassive. "Let's get down to business," I said, taking the seat. "You said you have information that could help our case against Clive." "I'm listening." Susan leaned forward. "Clive's involved in some shady business deals. Money laundering, insider trading, you name it. I've seen documents. I can prove it." I exchanged a glance with Hugo, who nodded. "All right," I said carefully. "And in exchange, you want a fair divorce settlement. Is that all?" She hesitated. "There's one more thing. I want immunity. I don't want to be implicated in anything." My anger flared, but I forced it down. "That's not my call to make. But if your information is good, the DA might cut a deal." Susan nodded. "Do we have a deal?" I stood and extended my hand. "We have a deal. But let me be clear, Susan. If you're playing us, I won't hesitate to bury you alongside Clive." "Understood." She flinched at the steel in my voice but took my hand. Understood. As we left the meeting, Hugo pulled me aside. You sure about this, Jason? It's a big risk. I nodded. I know, but it's a risk we have to take. Just make sure everything is airtight. No surprises. In the following weeks, Susan provided evidence beyond our expectations. We built a solid case against Clive. The net was closing in. But just when we thought we had everything under control, the other shoe dropped. I was at home, reviewing documents when my phone rang. It was Clifton. Jason, turn on the news now. I fumbled for the remote, and my heart sank. Clive was on the screen, smug as ever. The allegations against me are completely false. This is a smear campaign orchestrated by a disgruntled former employee and his unstable wife. I swore loudly. How the hell did this happen? Don't know, Clifton said. But we need to regroup. This could blow the whole case. We met with Hugo and Randolph to plan our next move. We need to know what Clive has on Susan, Hugo said. Why did she flip? Randolph began digging into her communications. We've come too far to let this slip away now, I said. Whatever it takes. Little did I know that the missing piece would be revealed in the most unexpected way. The courtroom was packed, and the air was thick with tension. I sat at the plaintiff's table. Hugo remained by my side as we waited for the proceedings to begin. Clive sat across the aisle with his high-priced lawyers, looking smug and confident as the judge called the court into order. I couldn't help but glance at Susan sitting in the gallery. Our gazes met briefly, and I was surprised to see fear in her eyes. Not fear of being exposed as a liar, but something deeper, more primal. The trial began with each side presenting their opening arguments. Hugo was masterful, presenting our case with precision and passion. But Clive had a good lawyer too, spinning a tale of conspiracy and false accusations. The jury seemed unsure. Then came the moment we dreaded. Susan was called to the stand. As she was sworn in, I leaned over to Hugo. This is it, I whispered. If she sticks to her retracted statement, we're done. Hugo nodded. Let's hope your ex-wife has a crisis of conscience. Clive's lawyer approached Susan with a predatory smile. Mrs. Cooper, please tell the court about your relationship with Mr. Adams. Susan's voice was barely audible as she began. Clive and I had an affair. It lasted about a year. And did Mr. Adams ever force you to do something you didn't want to do? Susan hesitated, her gaze darting to Clive, and then to me. No, she finally said. Everything was voluntary. I felt my heart sink. She was following the script, as we feared. Mrs. Cooper, Clive's lawyer pressed, in your initial statement, you claimed Mr. Adams coerced you into the affair by threatening your husband's career. Do you stand by that statement? The courtroom held its breath. Susan looked ill. Then suddenly, she burst into tears. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep lying. The judge banged his gavel. Order. Order in the courtroom. Susan looked directly at me, her eyes filled with fear and determination. Jason, I'm sorry. I should have told you the truth from the start. My mind raced. What truth? Mrs. Cooper, the judge said sternly. If you have anything to say, address the court. Susan took a deep breath. Your Honor, I want to change my testimony. The truth is, Clive Adams coerced me into the affair. But the threats weren't just about Jason's career. He threatened to expose financial irregularities at my company. I helped cover them up. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Clive's face turned a deep shade of red as he yelled at his lawyers. The judge banged his gavel again. I sat there stunned. Susan had done something illegal. Hugo grabbed my arm. This changes everything. If we can corroborate her story. But I barely listened. My focus was on Susan as she continued, recounting tales of fraud, blackmail, and manipulation. Clive had been aware of the discrepancies in the company's books, and he had threatened to expose her if she didn't comply. Susan spoke louder now, gaining confidence. It started with information about the company, but then he wanted more. I felt a flood of emotions. anger at Susan for her lies, disgust at Clive's manipulations, and reluctant admiration for her bravery in coming clean. Clive's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, this is hearsay. We have no proof of these threats or irregularities." But Susan wasn't finished. "There's proof," she said firmly. "I kept records, emails, phone recordings. I was afraid one day Clive would turn on me, so I protected myself." The judge looked at Susan. "Mrs. Cooper, would you be willing to turn over these records?" Susan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. They're in a safe deposit box. I can retrieve them within an hour." The judge called a recess to review the new evidence. I sat there, my mind spinning. Hugo was already on the phone, ordering his team to collect the records. Randolph slid into the seat next to me. "Holy cow, man," he whispered. "Did you have any idea?" I shook my head, still in shock. "None. I can't believe she kept this from me." Randolph squeezed my shoulder. "Hey, look on the bright side. This might be the final nail in Clive's coffin." I nodded slowly. "You're right. Let's just make sure those records get here safely. I wouldn't put it past Clive to try something desperate." The next hour was tense as we waited for Susan's evidence. Clive huddled with his lawyers, his face a mask of barely contained panic. Good, I thought. Let him sweat. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was electric. Susan's records were in, and the DA's face told me everything I needed to know. We had him. What followed was a legal bloodbath. Email after email, recording after recording, exposed Clive's web of deception. It wasn't just Susan. There were communications with other employees, part of a massive fraud and coercion scheme. I watched Clive's face pale with each new revelation. His lawyers looked unprepared for this turn of events. As the day progressed, the tide shifted decisively in our favor. The jury's expressions changed from doubt to outrage as they realized the full extent of Clive's crimes. Finally, the judge concluded the day's proceedings. As we filed out, I saw Clive being led away by his lawyers. For a moment, our gazes met. I saw something new in his eyes. Outside, amid a sea of reporters, I felt a hand on my arm. It was Susan. "Jason," she said softly, "can we talk?" I hesitated, torn between anger and gratitude. Eventually, I nodded. "Okay, but not here." We found a quiet corner away from the media. Susan looked exhausted. The weight of her lies finally lifted. "I'm sorry," she began. "I know that doesn't even scratch the surface, but I never meant for this to happen." I exhaled. "Why didn't you tell me about your financial problems? About Clive's blackmail? We could have faced it together." Tears welled in her eyes. "I was scared and ashamed. I thought I could fix everything before you found out, but I got in too deep." I felt a flash of old feelings for her, but they were quickly replaced by memories of her betrayal. "That's no excuse, Susan. You still lied. You had an affair." "I know," she whispered, "and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But Jason, you have to believe me. Clive is a monster. He uses people and discards them. I was just another pawn." I studied her face, searching for signs of deception, but saw only exhaustion and remorse. "Okay," I finally said. "I believe you. But this doesn't change anything between us. Too much has happened." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know. I hope someday you can forgive me." I watched her walk away, feeling a strange mix of relief, anger, and sadness. Randolph appeared at my side. "You okay?" I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. Yeah, I'm okay. We're almost there, Rand. So close to finishing this." He nodded with a smile. "Damn right we are. Clive Adams is going down, and we'll be there to see it." As we walked away from the courthouse, I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders. The road ahead remained uncertain. The legal battle was far from over, but for the first time in months, I felt hopeful. Justice was finally within reach, and I was determined to see it through to completion. The call came late one evening, As I was preparing for another restless night, the number on my phone gave me pause. It was Shelley, Susan's mother. We hadn't spoken since the trial, and as I responded, I felt uneasy. "Jason, it's Shelley. We need to talk. Can you meet me?" Her voice was tight with tension, and I felt my guard rise immediately. "What is this about, Shelley?" "Not over the phone. Please, Jason. It's important." 20 minutes later, I was settling into a booth at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Shelley was already there, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Her eyes darted nervously around the empty room. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down. I didn't know who else to turn to. I studied her face, noticing the deep worry lines that had grown more pronounced. "What's going on, Shelley? Is it about Susan?" She nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Jason, I've been such a fool. We all have. What exactly are you talking about?" Shelley took a deep breath. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Susan hasn't changed. All that remorse, everything during the trial, it was all a lie." I felt my jaw tighten, anger rising in my chest. "What do you mean, a lie?" "She's been playing us, Jason. All of us. The apologies, the tears, it was all to get a fair divorce settlement and distance herself from Clive's crimes." I leaned back, processing the information. Part of me wasn't even surprised. Susan's manipulative nature had become clearer over time. "How do you know this?" Shelley glanced around nervously again before leaning in closer. "Because she isn't alone. She's been seeing someone. Clive's brother, Jordan Adams." The name hit me like a punch. Jordan was known for being just as ruthless as Clive, if not more. "Are you sure?" I asked, my mind racing with the implications. Shelley nodded miserably. "I overheard them talking, Jason. They're planning something. Something to do with you, I think. I believe they mean to hurt you." I sat back, my mind reeling. Just when I thought the nightmare was over, a new chapter was beginning. "Why are you telling me this, Shelley?" I asked, scanning her face. "Susan is your daughter." Tears streamed down her face. "Because I can't stand by and watch her destroy more lives. I should have spoken up sooner. I won't make that mistake again." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Thank you for telling me, Shelley. I know it couldn't have been easy." She nodded and wiped her eyes. "Just take care, Jason. Susan and Jordan. They're dangerous. I'm scared of what they might do." As I left the cafe, my mind was already formulating plans. I needed to contact the authorities. I needed to protect myself. But first, I had to make a call. "Randolph, it's me. We have a problem." I updated him on what Shelley had told me. My voice was tight with tension. "Jesus Christ," Randolph swore. "Just when we thought it was over. What's the plan, Jay?" "First, we contact the police. If Susan and Jordan are planning something, we need to get ahead of it." "Good call. I'll start digging into Jordan Adams. See what I can find. Be careful. Man, these people are bad news." "I will. Trust me, I'm not taking any chances." The next morning, I found myself sitting across from Detective Simmons, the lead investigator on Clive's case. I laid out everything Shelley had told me. As I spoke, I watched Simmons' expression grow more serious. "This is serious, Mr. Cooper," he said once I'd finished. "We'll look into it right away. In the meantime, I'd advise you to be extra cautious. Maybe stay with a friend for a few days." I shook my head. "No, I'm not letting them chase me out of my own home. Just keep me updated, okay?" As I exited the police station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every passing car and stranger on the street seemed suspicious. I quickened my pace, eager to get home. But as the days passed with no sign of Susan or Jordan, I began to wonder if Shelley had been mistaken. Maybe she'd misheard them. Maybe the threat wasn't real. The attack caught me completely off guard. I was walking to my car after a long night at work, my mind occupied with a challenging project. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the overhead lights cast long shadows on the ground. I heard the footsteps too late. As I turned, a fist connected with my jaw, sending me sprawling. "Hello, Jason. Miss me?" A familiar voice. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, and saw Susan standing next to a man whose fist was still clenched. Jordan Adams. "Susan," I spat, struggling to my feet. "What is this?" She smiled coldly, sending a chill down my spine. "Consider this a warning, darling. You should have left well enough alone." Jordan stepped forward, towering over me. "You cost my brother everything," he growled. "Now it's time to repay the favor." Before I could react, his fist slammed into my stomach, knocking the air from my lungs. I doubled over, gasping, as more blows rained down. Susan's voice was detached. "If you go to the cops again, or interfere with our plans, this will look like a love tap in comparison." I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew, I was alone in the parking lot, my body aching, the taste of blood in my mouth. Trembling, I reached for my phone and dialed 911. As I waited for the ambulance, a sense of determination settled over me. Susan and Jordan thought they'd scared me, but they'd just made the worst mistake of their lives. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beep of the heart monitor. I lay there, bruised and bandaged, my mind racing with plans for revenge. A knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. Randolph entered, his face full of concern and barely contained anger. "Jesus, Jay," he said, taking in my battered appearance. "They did a number on you." I tried to sit up, wincing from the pain in my ribs. "They'll regret it." Randolph pulled up a chair and leaned in. "I've done some digging on Jordan Adams. This guy is bad news. He's got ties to organized crime, suspected in at least 2 murders. He makes Clive look like a Boy Scout." I nodded. "All the more reason to bring him down. What's our next move?" "Whoa, slow down, Rocky," Randolph said, raising his hands. "You're in no shape to make plans right now. You need to rest." I shook my head, ignoring the sharp pain the movement caused. "There's no time for that. Susan and Jordan think they've scared me off. We need to strike while they're overconfident." Randolph gave me a long look, then nodded. "All right. What's the plan?" Over the next few hours, we put together a strategy. We'd track Susan and Jordan's movements, gather evidence of their criminal activities, and build a case that not even the best lawyer could unravel. "It's risky," Randolph warned as he prepared to leave. "If they get wind of what we're doing." "They won't," I cut him off. "We'll be smarter this time. More careful." He nodded, giving my shoulder a gentle squeeze. "All right, man. I've got your back. Get some rest. We've got work to do." The following weeks were a blur of activity. After I was released from the hospital, Randolph and I created a makeshift command center in my living room. Photos, maps, and scraps of information covered the walls. Randolph's technical expertise proved invaluable. He hacked into Susan's email, and what we found was chilling. "Look at this," Randolph said one evening, pointing to his laptop screen. "They're planning to leave the country. Fake passports, new identities, the whole thing." I leaned in, scanning the emails. "When?" 3 days from now. They're booked on a flight to Buenos Aires." A surge of adrenaline shot through me. "Then we've got 3 days to nail them. Can you track their movements?" Randolph grinned, cracking his knuckles. "Already on it. I've got a trace on Susan's phone. Wherever they go, we'll know." As their departure date approached, tension mounted. We barely slept, running on coffee and takeout as we pieced together our case. Finally, the morning of their flight arrived. Randolph and I sat in my car outside Susan's apartment, watching as she and Jordan loaded suitcases into a taxi. "This is it," I said, starting the engine. "You ready?" Randolph nodded. "Born ready? Let's nail these guys." We followed at a discreet distance, my hands tight on the steering wheel as we neared the airport. I felt a familiar surge of anger and determination. "This ends today," I thought. Suddenly, Randolph grabbed my arm. They're pulling over. Sure enough, the taxi had stopped at a gas station a few miles from the airport. I watched as Jordan got out, heading inside the store. This might be our only chance, I spoke, my voice tense. We must confront them now before they disappear. Randolph looked at me with concern. Are you sure about this, Jay? Maybe we should call the police and let them handle it. I shook my head. There's no time. It's now or never. Before Randolph could protest, I was out of the car, striding purposefully toward the taxi. Susan saw me approaching, her eyes widening in fear and surprise. Jason, she gasped as I yanked open the taxi door. What are you doing here? I grabbed her arm and pulled her out. Finally, this is over. Jordan stepped out of the store. He froze for a split second when he saw me, then his face twisted with rage. You, he roared and charged at us. What followed was a blur of fists and fury. Jordan was bigger and stronger, but I was fueled by months of bottled-up anger and betrayal. We grappled on the asphalt as Susan screamed for us to stop. I tasted blood in my mouth and felt the sting from split knuckles, but I didn't stop. All the pain and humiliation of the past year poured out as I landed blow after blow on Jordan's face. In the distance, I heard sirens. Randolph must have called the cops. Good, I thought. Let's see what these two are truly capable of. As the police cars sped into the gas station, I delivered one last punch to Jordan's jaw. He fell limp beneath me. I staggered to my feet, chest heaving. Jason Cooper, a voice called out. I turned to see Detective Simmons approaching with his hand on his holster. Please step away from him. I raised my hands. Take a step back, Detective. I'm glad you could join us. As the officers swarmed around, they handcuffed Jordan and Susan. A strange sense of calm washed over me. It was over, finally, truly over. Randolph appeared at my side and handed me a bottle of water. You okay, man? I nodded, wincing as I sipped. My body ached, but in a good way. The ache of victory. Yeah, I'm good. We watched as Susan and Jordan were loaded into separate police cars and driven away. My anger drained, replaced by profound relief. Come on, Randolph said, clapping my shoulder. Let's get you cleaned up. We've got one heck of a story to tell. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as we waited for the proceedings to begin. I sat in the front row with Randolph beside me. My hands were tightly clasped in my lap, hiding their trembling. The door opened, and a hush fell over the room as Susan and Jordan were brought in, both pale and disheveled in their prison jumpsuits. Susan's eyes met mine briefly. I saw a mix of regret and fear, but I couldn't care less. All rise. The bailiff called as the judge entered the courtroom, and the trial began. I listened with satisfaction as the prosecutor presented the case against Susan and Jordan. The evidence we'd gathered, combined with witness testimony, painted a damning picture of their actions. Your Honor, the prosecutor stated, the state will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendants, Susan Cooper and Jordan Adams, conspired to commit fraud, assault, and attempted murder. I felt a surge of pride as Randolph was called to the stand. He described our investigation with steady confidence, detailing the evidence we uncovered. I observed Susan and Jordan. Jordan remained stoic, his jaw clenched, but Susan seemed to crumble with every new piece of evidence. Finally, it was my turn to testify. As I took the stand, I felt a rush of adrenaline. This was my chance to share my story, to see justice served. Mr. Cooper, the prosecutor began, can you tell the court about the night you were assaulted? I took a deep breath, recounting the events of that night in the parking lot. I noticed Susan flinch, her eyes full of tears, but I felt no sympathy, only cold determination. And what happened after the attack? The prosecutor inquired. I was in the hospital, I said, my voice steady. But as soon as I was released, I realized I needed to act. These people weren't going to stop, so Randolph and I began our own investigation. The defense tried to discredit our testimony, portraying Susan and Jordan as victims, but their efforts fell flat against the overwhelming evidence. As the trial neared its conclusion, I held my breath. Would the jury see through Susan's tears? Would justice finally be served? The wait for the verdict was excruciating. Days felt like weeks. Finally, we were called back to the courtroom as the jury foreman stood. Randolph placed a hand on my shoulder, silently offering support. For the fraud conspiracy charge, the foreman said, "We find the defendants guilty." I exhaled deeply, not realizing I'd been holding my breath. For the charge of assault, he continued, "We find the defendants guilty." Susan let out a sob, her shoulders shaking. For the charge of attempted murder, he finished, "We find the defendants guilty." It was over. They were going away for a long time. The judge read Jordan's sentence. 25 years. Susan was sentenced to 15. A weight lifted off my shoulders. It was finished, finally, completely. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. "Mr. Cooper, how do you feel about the verdict?" One shouted, thrusting a microphone toward me. I paused, choosing my words carefully. Justice was served, I said simply. That's all I have to say. As I pushed through the crowd with Randolph, I noticed Shelley standing on the edge of the throng. Our eyes met, and I saw a mixture of grief and relief. I gave her a small nod, acknowledging her role in closing this chapter. "You okay, man?" Randolph asked as we walked to the car. I nodded, feeling the tension of the past few months begin to subside. Yes, I think I am. The next few weeks were a blur as I adjusted to life after the trial. When the media frenzy died down, I found myself facing a future I never imagined. Randolph stopped by one evening as I sat on my porch, nursing a beer. "So," he said, settling into a chair beside me, "what comes next for Jason Cooper?" I took a long pull from my bottle, considering the question. Honestly, I'm not sure. For so long, everything was about Susan, Clive, and Jordan. I'm not sure I remember how to just live. Randolph nodded. "You ever think about getting out of town? A fresh start?" The idea took root in my mind and quickly grew more appealing. You know what? That's not a bad idea. Over the next few days, the plan came together. I decided to sell my home, quit my job, and relocate to a small coastal town a few hours away, a place where no one knew my name or my story. As I packed, I came across old photos of Susan and me from happier times. For a moment, I felt a pang, not regret, just sadness for what could have been. Then I remembered everything that had happened, and the feeling faded. I tossed the photos without a second glance. The day of my departure was bright and clear. Randolph came to see me off, helping me load the last of my boxes into the truck. "You sure about this?" he asked, standing in the now empty driveway. I nodded, feeling more confident than I had in months. "Yeah, Randy, I need a fresh start." He pulled me into a bear hug. "I'm going to miss you, man. Don't be a stranger, okay?" "I won't," I promised. "And hey, come visit anytime. I hear the fishing's great down there." As I drove away, watching my old life fade in the rearview mirror, I felt a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited about the journey. Weeks later, I stood on a cliff overlooking the ocean. The wind whipped through my hair, and the sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. As the waves crashed below, I felt my anger and bitterness fade. I thought of Susan, Clive, and Jordan, the pain and betrayal of the last year. But the memories no longer hurt me. They were just that, memories. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, another chapter in my life came to a close. I smiled, feeling peace for the first time in what seemed like forever. The future stretched before me, full of possibilities, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next. I turned away from the ocean and walked back to my new home. My footsteps were light and purposeful. The old Jason Cooper, the man driven by pain and vengeance, was gone. In his place stood someone who had survived the storm and come out stronger. As I reached my front door, I paused and looked back at the darkening sky. "Goodbye, Susan," I whispered, not with malice or regret, but with certainty. Then I stepped inside, closing the door on the past and opening it to whatever the future might bring. The price of betrayal had been paid. It was time to collect, with the promise of a new beginning. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.